Good morning, and thank you for inviting me along to talk to you this morning. I'm certainly going to be, I think, taking a rather different approach from looking at the production and the forms and the fabrics, which we've heard quite understandably a good deal about this morning, to move downstream somewhat to look at the actual distribution process of the materials. And in looking at that, I'm particularly going to try to focus, with the aid of an example based on Gloucester, the TF10D Rhodian amphorae, to look to see what is actually driving or constructing the supply chains, to understand better the material that's arriving in different places. And in that respect, I'm going to use this morning really two parts with the talk. The first to examine a brief conceptual framework, looking within the context of the Roman economy, which is rather different from the economy we have today, a model identifying key supply channel members, and with that a supply chain model which we can then apply in the second part of the production to the Rhodian amphorae, identifying where they come from, looking at the King's Home assemblage, and then looking at how the supply chain model might apply to that particular material. So, without further ado, a few words first on the Roman economy. The Roman economy was very much what we would regard today as a developing economy. In other words, it's not an industrial and certainly not a post-industrial model. It's very heavily based on what we'll call agrarian output. That's to say agricultural material and using other materials from the land, including clay and timber, for pottery production. And this tends to be based on a model which is dominated by not so much trade but self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency may not simply involve local production, because if one regards some of these estates, of course, the Cestia estate in Campania, for example, many of the continental estates were enormously large. They often spanned what would now be several countries. And looking at supply chains and supply flows of material, it's not always easy to simply say that material we find in shipwrecks, for example, necessarily involves trade items. They can often be internal transfers between different estates or reciprocal exchanges between others. And finally, the role of the Roman state. The Roman state was, of course, a major player in the economy, both through the annona, the agricultural composition of the tax system, and the redistribution to supply the military and the state's other actors. Market activity certainly existed, but the model that we see in the Roman period, marketing is a subsidiary part of activity. It's there, it's important, but almost this model is flipped on its head, with what dominates the economy today was a subsidiary part in the Roman times, and what dominated for the Romans still exists. All these components are still recognizable in our modern economy, but the balance has changed. The fact the balance has changed, I think, doesn't invalidate looking at trade and looking at merchants, because they do exist in the Roman period. They are clearly significant, but with that caveat, my focus is therefore going to be on this minor element for them, an important element for us. And the first step is to try to identify the individual actors. Are they the same in the Roman period as today? Are there any new ones? Have any disappeared? And the short answer is no. The key players in the trade component of the economy are still the producers at the upstream end, producing the individual items, the consumers at the downstream end, who are the users of the components and the commodities, and between the important role of the state and a subsidiary role of merchants, the public sector as we know it today with the state, the private sector activity with the merchants. So those are the actors, but the important considerations are how do those actors then shape and drive the system. And in that respect, I offer a relatively simple model with, at the one end of the system, the producers, at the other end of the system, the consumers, the goods moving from one to the other, but moving in a series of thrusts. If the producers are dominating, a model I've called the producer push model, whereby manufacturers with surplus items seek to get them to markets downstream. The potential of the consumer pull model, consumers who under Romanization are recognizing items existing, demanding those and seeking to obtain them from the manufacturing sources. And between merchants and the state, again bridging the gap between the original producers and the end users. The state supplying principally its own resources, its own forces, its own authorities, but with some spillover into local populations. And one thinks, for example, of Vicky, where material is maybe moving from the state forts into the local population, or the merchants who have a particular role here that makes them distinct. The merchants, particularly cross-channel exchange, are seeing opportunities on one side of the channel which consumers on the other side are unaware of, and seeing the opportunity of intermediation, of identifying unfulfilled needs, identifying sources where those materials can be obtained, to actually act as merchants do today and make their profit from filling those gaps. So a simple model produced there, either direct from the producers to the consumers, consumer pull, consumers driving the process, or the merchants or the states becoming the active forces. So how does that work in practice? Well, the issue to observe is that not all those potential participants are always active in a recognizable form. And the unfilled boxes on this particular model are, in fact, for example, the passive actors in a particular trade flow. The heavily shaded boxes, go back one, go back two. The heavily shaded boxes are what appears to be the dominant drivers of the system through the evidence of people who are controlling particular trade flows, supported on occasions perhaps by the subsidiary activities of one of the other channel members. What I want to do with that particular model, having recognised it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's something that is adapted to particular products at particular times, is to then look how that can apply. Before I take that final step, can I just, though, formally identify that I'm using terms here that are, it says, modernist concepts, supply chains, not something, a Roman citizen or Roman administrator would even have thought in terms of. The modernist thinking, though, recognises, or hopefully recognises, that while Romans wouldn't have thought in this way, we can't think as Romans did. We can't unlearn what we know. We can't detach ourselves from the environment and the culture that we're based in. What we can do, though, is to apply this type of approaches to things that the Romans would never have thought of. No Roman would ever have been able to step back sufficiently far from the supply chains to understand its overall concept. They would be dealing face to face, pragmatically, with the people in front of them. And by stepping back And looking then at the macro level rather than the individual micro activities, we may then be able to get a better understanding of what is structuring these forces, what's driving these models, and what's leading particular products to be active in this type of exchange or not. I'll come back to that at the final slide in the conclusions. I want to apply that conceptual model to a very simple product, and that's the, with the Gloucester connection, the Rhodian amphorae, the Gloucester type fabric 10D. And in terms of that particular product, we're now into the second part, the application part of the talk. The Rhodian amphorae, I'm sure most of you will be well familiar with this particular type of vessel. If not, I gather you're going to be looking at one this afternoon in the museum, so you can actually see one hands-on. But they are cylindrical necked amphorae with tapering bodies. Their origin is principally, I think, from the Isle of Rhodes, but although they do occur in the Aegean and the Western Asia Minor in smaller numbers. Contents predominantly wine, but occasionally other things, figs and honey are thought to have been carried as well. And the supply route from the island itself would have been through the Eastern Mediterranean to probably somewhere around Marseille to enter the Rhone, Rhine shipping routes, to supply, particularly with military supply, the northern frontiers, ending up, of course, then at the Channel and across Channel into the British or Britannia market. Data sources on the amphorae themselves are fairly easily accessible. Pottery, the Archaeological Data Service, Internet Archaeology have all a good synopsis of the vessel and its details, so this slide merely introduces it. The interesting aspect of the Rhodian amphorae TF10D spikes at about the period the Kingsholm fort is at peak activity. And the island itself appears in 4 literature sources. They're listed there: Cassius Dio, Suetonius has a couple of references, and Tacitus. The only one of those that really does more than simply acknowledge Rhodes became a province in AD 44 is Dio. And Dio, in a single sentence, explains that the Rhodians lost their independence as a result of impaling certain Roman citizens. The Roman authorities didn't tend to like that kind of treatment to their own, and it is believed, therefore, that in 44 the island was annexed early in Claudius's reign, and for the next 10 years the Rhodian amphorae spike so much that they almost drive the Dressel 2-4 out of the supply regarding the wine distribution. The late Professor David Peacocks actually identified that episode and speculated that it may well be that as reparations for the offences the Rhodians caused, that the Roman authorities may have been confiscating a very large proportion of the island's wine output and using that to supply their own military needs, and therefore rather conveniently taking advantage of the punishment that they're meting out. That idea has been followed by several other leading authors. I'll accept it as a working hypothesis this morning, but obviously it's not a proven fact, but it's a nice, convenient theory. Looking then at Kingsholm, the fort itself, or fortress, was established, we think, in the very late 40s, went on until probably about 61. The exact period of almost of this 44 to 54 falls slap bang within the peak of that fortress, allowing obviously for a year or so for the materials to pass through the supply chain. The Cam 184, the Rhodian amphora, the type 10D, figure prominently in Hirst's material collection from the King's Home excavations, of which we've seen the publication a couple of times previously in this morning's sessions. About 60% of the material Hirst excavated consisted of amphora, and about a third of those amphora were fabric 10D, the Rhodian. So it's about 20% of the total. There were something like 400 or 500 weights of material produced from a trench about 30 metres long by about 10 metres wide. So that's perhaps not representative of the whole fort assemblage, but it's representative of what Hirst conveniently put his trench over. And of those, the wine amphora, Hilary Cool, in her work on eating and drinking in Rome and Britain, identified 90% of the amphora from King's Home were the Cam 184, the Rhodian fabric 10D. So it's an important part of the connection with a significant enough quantity to be meaningful. So who's driving this system? Well, if we look back at those four key players, the first is that there's little prospect. It's actually the producers themselves. Most of their output, if David Peacock's right, has been confiscated by the military. They've probably little more than to meet their own basic needs. The state is quite likely to be a strong player. Again, if Peacock's theory of reparations and the Roman using the material for their own military needs is correct. Merchants, well, it's difficult for them to get hold of the commodity if there's not much of it around, but merchants, remember, might have quite an important secondary role supplying the transport itself if the Roman state aren't dealing it with their own distributors, their own legionary or auxiliary shippers. And finally, consumer pull, could that be a factor? Well, there are a couple of Cam 184s identified from civilian sources, but they mainly tend to be at sites like Sheepen and Colchester, where it's quite possible to explain those away as diplomatic gifts rather than consumer demand. So within here, the producers, the consumers, probably not significant players if our understanding's correct. The state certainly is likely to be. The merchants may have a subsidiary role, but not proven. And hence, within my model of highlighting the key players, I've only identified here the state as a dominant key player. The model, therefore, is very simple, and you may say, well, it's so simple, that is it really worth showing? Well, I'd argue within a 10 or 15 minute presentation it would be quite difficult and challenging to take on a complex model. But it's an illustration of how the system might work. These, of course, are not quantifiable. These are measuring in what one calls ordinal terms. We're ranking the importance of players strongly or otherwise. One can't apply to this model as it stands cardinal measurement of exact numbers, although that may be possible if our assemblages become clearer. So where does that leave us in terms of the supply? And this is really my wrap-up slide now to draw things together. Agreed, the Cam 184, the Gloucester type fabric 10D is a very simple explanation if our analysis is correct. But there are, I promise you, much more useful and complex applications of these models which aren't clear-cut. A couple of examples I'm not going to go into, but happy to explain in due course. The Dressel 1B amphora in the pre-conquest period actually goes through a number of phases, from obviously state involvement to possibly consumers being active in drawing in this material. Even better, and not to anticipate Paul's next talk, but to pick up the Dressel 20, the Batican amphora from the south of Spain have, at least in the 2nd century, 3 distinct supply routes driven in different ways, covering different parts of the country, where different merchants, different shippers are involved apparently in the system. So this model has wider amphorae applications, but it also has significant applications for fabrics such as terra sigillata. If one thinks of the number of Gaulish Samian kilns, some of which are dominant in the British market, some which hardly appear at all, but are dominant elsewhere in Europe, to look at who's driving the supply from particular kilns or particular areas may be something we can shed more light on by identifying the distribution process, who's behind this process and who are the key players. And that varies over time. But there is scope, I think, to use the simple model in a much wider way than I've done here. And it may provide important clues further down the line. But that's beyond what I'd have time to discuss this morning. So thank you for listening. Thank you.